So good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm sure some of you have probably been with us a few times before in the last 2 or so weeks. So this is the fourth of the DARE UK, or sort of the Data Analytics Research Environments UK workshops that we'll be running. So this is 4 out of 6. We have another 2 more towards the end of this month. And this today is our data and discovery sort of focused workshop. And just wanted to say thank you all for being here and for giving us 2 hours of your time on a Thursday morning. We're going to jump into initially just to start with Hans-Erik Aronson, who's the director for the DARE UK program, is just going to give us an introduction to the program. I think for some of you, maybe it will be a repetition, but I think we just always need to do that to make sure that everyone in the call has a good orientation of what the program's about. And then we'll move into specifically the data and discovery sort of theme or area, where Jerry Riley will talk us through that and through some of the recommendations and our early thinking before we then move into the breakout rooms and get into some, I'm sure, interesting and constructive discussions. So without further ado then, and I will also share my screen, I'll hand over to you, Hans-Erik, and you can take us away.
Okay, if we can okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Hans-Erik Aronson. I'm the director of DARE UK Phase 1. Thank you all for joining us. Next slide, please. So the DARE UK program is a pan-UKRI initiative. That's very important. We cover all of UKRI. The aim of the program is to enable a step change in UKRI's capability for secure sharing, linkage, and analysis of sensitive data for research and innovation, both at pace and at scale. Next slide, please. This is a multi-phase, multi-year program. So again, we are in phase 1 right now. This is the design and dialogue phase. And it's an extensive program of community engagement with researchers, technologists, and the public that will culminate in a co-designed blueprint for the next generation of trusted research environments with standards access accreditation and ethics and policies sort of based on trustworthiness, security, and interoperability. The first phase started in July of last year and will end at the end of August of this year, and will then be followed by 2 more phases. Next slide, please. So this is so HDR UK and ADR UK were jointly commissioned by UKRI to undertake phase 1 of the program. The delivery team is based at HDR UK, but the program is indeed under joint management by HDR and ADR UK. So that's important. It's not a health-specific enterprise. We're looking at data across all the domains of UKRI. And so the question we're trying to answer then is how should national secure and interoperable digital research infrastructure and associated services be designed and implemented to connect and analyze complex, sensitive, often unconstrained data from across disciplines and sectors in a flexible, efficient, and sustainable way. Next slide, please. An important aspect of this is that we are not starting from scratch. There is a cross-council need. We believe that it's federated infrastructure is technically feasible. It is ethically and legally feasible and would be trusted by the public. That is absolutely key, that we have the public's trust. So we do this in a trustworthy manner. It is also feasible to do this within the funding and time envelope set by UKRI. And there is a strong buy-in from the research councils, the government, and the data custodians, and the researchers for this approach. Next slide, please. In the fall, we did a landscape review of the data landscape across UKRI. We spoke to people across all 4 nations, and we found 6 themes that were of concern, or that we needed to focus on in this discovery phase or phase 1. So they fall into 6 classes. So it's data and discovery, including technical standards. That would be data standards, metadata catalogs, and common data models. Access and accreditation, including government standards, rules, and frameworks for enabling data access. That would be also accrediting both TREs and researchers. Digital research infrastructure, that would include the physical and software infrastructure. Capability and capacity, including shortages of data scientists and data engineers, and career pathways for those maintaining the infrastructure. Demonstrating trustworthiness, that would be gaining the public and organizational trust, and addressing risk aversion of those holding data. That's something that came up a lot in the landscape review. I would say that we need to be mindful of the requirements that they're under, the data custodians, to actually safeguard the data. But either way, we need to do all of this in a trustworthy manner. And lastly, funding and incentives, including the current research culture, the need for sustainable funding for infrastructure and research, as well as to appropriately incentivize the creation of a joint federated way of working. Next slide, please. So if you look at this diagram, the hexagons in teal are the 6 areas of concern that we are addressing in this journey. Our process to do this is really public and stakeholder engagement, and a series of sprint exemplar projects that are underway right now. They were commenced January 4th and will end in August. We have a couple of meetings during that journey where we can actually learn from the sprint exemplar, their progress that will inform our blueprint. And the end products then will be the blueprint that I mentioned, and as well as detailed delivery plans for phase 2 and an outline delivery plan for phase 3. And lastly, a business case for UKRI to make all of this work from a financial perspective. Next slide, please. Again, this is a 3-phase multi-year project with the key stakeholders being the public, researchers, data custodians, and the TRE community. Next slide, please. And this is the delivery team. So I'm the director of the team, and you have a number of us on the call today. Jerry Riley, the design authority, Fergus, our senior program manager, Michelle Amugi, program manager, Lizzie Wayne, who is our communications and engagement manager. And we also have 2 people who are not on the call today, Lucy Gold, who's our finance business partner, and Sushil Varma, who's a technical lead. I included 3 links at the bottom of this slide. One is to our main website, the other one is to landscape review, and finally the sprint exemplar projects. And you will be able to access these slides later, so you can get the links from those. And I have one more slide if you were to advance, Fergus. So just briefly, TREs again are safe environments to conduct analysis on sensitive data. They're governed by 5 principles: safe people, safe projects, safe settings, safe data, and safe outputs. I think they're somewhat self-explanatory. We have a lot of people on the call right now that probably have heard this many times, but basically you credit people, projects, and the settings themselves before you can embark on this journey. The data needs to be carefully kept and basically kept secure, and access should only be granted to appropriate people. And lastly, when you do an analysis, the output that you take from the analysis cannot be just exported out without any control parameters. So there are output checks to make sure that the output that is generated can actually exit the environment safely and be, say, published. And I will hand over to Jerry at this point.
Thank you, Hans-Erik. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, is that coming through? Can I just have a thumbs up from somebody?
With you.
Good. Okay, excellent. So thank you, Hans-Eric, and thank you everybody for joining today's workshop. I know some of you will have been through several of these before, so we really do value the input we're receiving from these. So what I want to work through today is some of the very early thoughts we're having around data and discovery, and looking at this from the breadth of what that might mean across doing research on cross-council data. These are early thoughts, they span quite a wide area, and I know to some these are going to be your lifeblood. It's what you live with every day. For others, some of these will be concepts that you probably touch more lightly. So we know that some of this is perhaps a little bit more technical than some of the other areas, but I've tried to keep it at the level of requirements as we work through. So when I presented, we'll have a little bit of time for questions and clarification. Do please feel free to ask. We want an open, respectful discussion, so that we all have areas that we're not sure of. So do feel free to ask either Mike or on the chat. So one of the important things as we look at data across the councils, and I'm sorry this is a bit wordy, it's one of these definitions where the teams working on this have been trying to get everybody's thoughts together, is actually what do we mean by sensitive data? And we're still working to refine exactly where we're coming at this from a program point of view, but essentially consider this as trying to look at what's needed for research on data that might be potentially disclosive. So this could be the data that comes from medical health records, it could be data that comes from education, but also we want to make sure that as we go through this, this is also building out approaches that works with that data alongside data, maybe climatic data, but also we can use learnings that spread out into other areas of sensitive data that might be commercially sensitive. So industrial data that comes from maybe the retail sector. So we want the thoughts and ideas that come through this to actually have good reuse across the whole of the UKRI Council. So view the data as broad, and it's not just how do we use the sensitive data itself, but also how do we use that sensitive data in conjunction with other data. So why the data and discovery theme? As Hans-Eric mentioned in his introduction, we saw 6 themes come through from our initial discussions with stakeholders, and unsurprisingly, data and discovery was quite a significant theme. So having an approach that will work across councils around data lifecycle management is really important. We want to make sure that the right data is available to the right people for the right purpose with the appropriate governance in secure TREs, in secure CRE setting, but also that that data can actually be used. We don't want to be in a position where we have such a structure that, yeah, it's all secure, it's so secure that we actually don't make effective use of data for research. So it's how we do this in a way that provides effective use, and effective use where in cross-council use cases. We want to make sure that embedded within that are the FAIR principles that many of you will be familiar with, that the data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and that all of those principles matter. We can focus on elements of those, and today we probably will focus in on some, but actually all 4 principles are really important. We need the visibility of the data that's available. Okay, we need, you can't do research if you don't know the data exists for you to do that research. And again, we need that in a way that works on a cross-council way. There are great best practices, great tools within each council area, but we've got to make sure that we can work the remit that we can do that much more in a much more integrated way, and that we have an approach that is pragmatic around providing metadata across data sets from different domains, not trying to boil the ocean, not trying to solve every possible approach to metadata and modeling, but that we have sufficient minimal metadata and integration of how we hold that metadata registries and catalogs, that we can actually share it and look for novel linkage and novel research opportunity. So I'm conscious that some of the people on today's call will be absolutely familiar with metadata, and some it's probably one of those jargon words. Conceptually, this is not difficult. That metadata is data about data. Having just a data set has limited value if we don't understand what the data is, its quality, its volume, how it was collected, who's responsible for the licensing, the structure of the data set, what the variables mean, how they're encoded. So metadata is how we effectively describe the data itself. And metadata itself is data. So we've got to have an approach, and there are some really good standards, and HDR UK, in collaboration with other people, have been working some standards, sort of standardized approaches around metadata. But actually, to address some of the use cases that DARE UK has been asked to address, we've really got to be able to spread that in a more cross-council way, not by replacing what's already going on in the councils, but by looking at how we integrate in our different approaches to metadata and metadata catalogs. One other concept we'll touch on in some of the recommendations are digital object identifiers, what typically are referred to as DOIs. And again, very aware that many councils and many organizations already are using DOIs. Papers have been associated with DOIs for a long time. DOIs, again, conceptually simple, but it's about having a single, unique, persistent identifier for an object, so that when I refer to this particular item, you know it's exactly the same item. Its name might change, its title might change, its location, but you know there is a single identifier that follows a universally agreed schema that we would use to describe journal articles, reports, data sets, etc. And importantly, for what we're discussing today, using that to provide a persistent and unique way of identifying data sets, be they original data sets or actually be this data that derives out of research activity. And that allows us to be sure of what we're sharing, sure of what we're describing, but also to look at the provenance of the data. So there's a set of 5 recommendations. What I'm saying here is these are really early. We're starting to flesh out thoughts and ideas coming up. So what we'd really like to hear in the discussions in the breakout rooms are initial thoughts and ideas. So I'm just going to touch on the recommendations, and we'll go into depth of discussion as we go through into the breakout rooms. So core mission for DARE UK is to look at how we do cross-council research on sensitive data. Fundamental to that is how do we actually get that data into a place, into a trusted research environment where we can do that research and bring in sensitive data, but also augmenting that possibly with other sensitive data, but also possibly with open data. So want to look at how we do that in an effective way. So how do we pilot provisioning pipelines that will work across councils with a future federated approach to trusted research environments? There are also use cases where running the analysis locally in each TRE and then aggregating results isn't viable. So we do need to look at how we can do data provisioning between TREs in a secure way, and this will This will probably flesh out a little bit more in the final workshop of this series of 6. How do we link data sets from across councils? How do we do that in a secure way? Do we need to look at novel approaches to a third-party linkage service that is secure and we can do in a transparent way that maintains that transparency to the public in a trustworthy approach? And how do we build on best practices? Best practices right through the life cycle, but in particular, one of the FAIR principles we touched on was reuse. And reuse means need a structured approach to archival capability, which is well established in some research domains, less so in others. So how do we look at this? And what we'd like to do is look at this during phase 2 of the DARE program, with the potential that we would come back with a business case in phase 3 for more extensive development and deployment. The second one is the nature of data is changing. We're moving, and some fast, some maybe less fast, but we're definitely moving into a world where there's new data types from the Internet of Things, such as wearables. Some of these are also changing how that data might be delivered. The nature of data may not be more static data sets that get refreshed on an annual, a monthly, or even a daily basis, but actually a constant. So we have a more streaming model of data. And we're also seeing research that starts to see requirements for near real-time access to data. So what we want to look at is, how does that affect the different council areas? What are you seeing? How are you seeing this change within your areas? We want to hear about this. What does that have in terms of the implication for the life cycle of data? How do we change that? How does it affect things like provisioning? And we're going to make recommendations around piloting some of this in the next phase of the DARE UK program, perhaps looking as an example at wearables data, which we know is affecting a number of different research areas, and is something where we have a emerging need, it's probably emerged, to actually integrate this with other data that we already have available. So we're looking to pilot a service during phase 2, or propose to pilot a service during phase 2. So is that something you think is important and viable? The third one is around privacy enhancing technologies. So as we look at doing research across different areas, there's an element here of what technologies can help us make that more secure. Are there existing established approaches? Some of the privacy enhancing technologies are well established, such as differential privacy, becoming established in some of the uses of things like homomorphic encryption, but also there are new and novel technologies emerging in this space at all times. So there's a lot of work already going on around privacy enhancing technologies. There's just been a series of workshops run on behalf of the ICO. So we're suggesting exploration of this during the next phase in collaboration. We shouldn't be duplicative. We shouldn't be reinventing stuff that's already going on, but building on that, looking at recommendations that could be applied across council, and then looking at how we could prototype some of that work during the second phase of the DARE program, but also building not just the technology, but the understanding of where and when certain technologies. These are very different technologies, some applicable for some situations, some applicable for others. So building the training, the guidelines, the knowledge base for where the PETs can be used effectively for research and to build out research infrastructure. A lot of this sits on the top of us understanding what data we've got. So making your data findable means how do we get discovery? So we don't need a common defined deep metadata standard across every data set from every council. But we do need to think about how we can make discovery work across council data sets. So do we need a cross UKRI council on metadata to build out a minimal specification that can work, whether it's a health data set, an education data set, or a set of historical records? So how do we make this work from a cross-council approach? How do we integrate that in with how we support DOIs, so that we ensure that we can have definitions that are consistent and persistent? And how do we build this out in a set of catalogs? So we don't need to rely on centralization, but we do have discovery that can do discovery across councils, across the network of data custodians that we have, and also across into open data sets, so that we're not just looking at those data sets that are actively managed and curated by data custodians, but also the broader set of data that is available to us. And finally, what should our approach be to digital object identifiers, to DOIs? Many institutes, probably several councils, are already looking at their approaches to DOIs beyond publications. Do we need a consistent approach? Should this be done led at a UKRI level? How do we integrate this in with those who are already well down the path of working with DOIs, such as some of the larger data custodians? Is this something we should be mandating, so that as you go through your research life cycle, as you get your outputs to address that reusable element of the FAIR principles, should we be mandating DOIs so that we have a clear view as we go integrated in with catalogs and with an archival service, so that we can use DOIs to have a more robust approach to ensuring that we can reuse outputs from previous research and not be duplicative and doing the same curation and the same linkage of data sets over and over again. So how could we use DOIs more effectively? How do we do that in a cross-council way? So what we'd like to do is under that recommendation is explore your own experiences. If you've got experiences already, how do we build on best practices, but how do we make this more effective on a pan-UKRI basis? So as we go into our breakout rooms, we will look at each of the recommendations and just spend a little time working through them, getting your thoughts and ideas and perspectives, which are so important to us as we build out the late more final recommendations. There are some things we'd like to throw out there as questions, and these are really just to see the thoughts around what are your current challenges around data discovery. What are your challenges around data preparation and provisioning? We know that's challenging in lots of areas. How should data change it? What are the novel data types? How far should we go in looking from a UKRI perspective in mandating metadata standards, catalogs, and DOIs? How do we look at making reuse and transparency more effectively? And as we do this, we focused this morning on data and discovery, but should some of the things we're doing here around metadata and DOIs also be extending out into our people, our projects, and our facilities? Should we be trying to really describe a whole estate here in a way that we have a better understanding of what we have, what infrastructure we have, as well as what data we have underneath that infrastructure? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. We've got a few minutes for questions and clarifications, and I'll let Fergus take back the share. Let me just stop sharing, and then we will drop out into our breakout rooms for 2 sessions of discussion. So Fergus, do you want to facilitate the questions and
Yep.
and clarifications?
Yep, no worries, Jerry, thanks. So just feel free to, I see Ada already has her hand up, so feel free to just put your hand up or pop a question in the chat and we can get into it for about 5 minutes, I would say. So Ada.
Yeah, hi everyone. So delighted to hear the word metadata mentioned so many times. I don't think I have ever experienced this before. So that's really great to see, because that's the lifeblood of what we do as in data management. I have a clarification to make, and is the definition of sensitive data, which the way that we are using this term is for the GDPR definition of sensitive data, which is anything to do with racial or ethnic origin. I have it here, health-related data, genetic data, things that are sensitive and could cause upset to the cohort members or the participants, the volunteers who provide the data. Different to that is the disclosivity of the data, which is, I think, more in line with what Jerry was talking about the potential re-identification of the data. So that these 2 parameters, sensitivity and disclosivity, is important to, I think, to have the definitions right, so that we are in line with GDPR established definitions. So.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's actually been quite a debate, quite honestly, and it's not. It's still a debate. We're trying to narrow down with colleagues elsewhere in UKRI on the scope of what, for this program, we consider the data that's in scope. So I'm well aware that the way we describe sensitive data is not necessarily aligned to a UK GDPR view. And it's actually wider than your second thought as well, because there's a view that this should go beyond the disclosive into what might be commercially sensitive data as well as personally sensitive data. So it's a moving target still, if I'm perfectly honest, and I'll treat today as we're on Chatham House rules. I'll be open that we're not closed on the nature of the data. My personal view is that I would like to focus on what you describe as potentially disclosive data, but there is still debate on this point.
Great, thanks, Ida. James, you have your hand up.
Hi there, thanks. It was kind of a bit of follow-on from Ada as well. Yeah, for GDPR, watch out for the protected characteristics of other laws as well that pop into the requirements of GDPR. But my point I want to make was working with the ONS. They're trialing something called functional anonymization, functional anonymization, and what that actually means and how that plays, and that's a really new concept. So the actual functionality of the technology creating the ability to for data to be classified as remaining anonymous. So that's another viewpoint to throw in.
That would be a really interesting one, James. I don't know which breakout. When you get to the breakout room, can you grab that idea and put it onto the
Sure.
Jamboard, because that probably fits as a useful adjunct to the discussions around privacy enhancing technologies, and it'd be great to capture that.
Sure, no problem.
Thanks, James. I also realize we're seeing James, I think, for the 3rd or 4th time now, so thank you, James. Just looking at the chat, so a comment from Andy Turner here. There are also data that are dangerous. Example, some quantum technologies are embargoed.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I suppose there's a spectrum of risk, I suppose, associated with sensitive data that we need to think about here. And then a question from Rosie French. So there's a proliferation of metadata standards used across data management disciplines, for example, DDI, StatDCAT, etc. UKRI mandated standards would need to allow for interoperability. How are their UK mapping metadata standards and their interoperability?
So Rosie, I'm not doing the sloping shoulders here, honestly, but what and I'm actually incredibly conscious of the fact that there are already a proliferation of metadata standards out there. Very conscious of it, work that I've actually already done in this area. What we're doing at this stage is just taking a recommendation for the next phase of work here. I think the next phase of work has got to bridge this question of how we handle the existing set of standards that exist out there. When it's certainly my view that any work should not be going out there and creating another standard. We already have more than enough standards in this space, but it is about how we use what's already out there, understand what's already out there, but actually surface that in a way that supports the use cases that we really need for DARE, which is around cross-council discoverability. So we're not at this stage in the first phase trying to look at that mapping. We're just going to probably be making a recommendation that that will be a second phase activity. There's already been a lot of work on this. The work that's been done by the UK Health Data Research Alliance, and which has involved actually some people outside of health, has already done quite a lot of work on that, and that has drawn from existing standards as well. So there is a good body of initial work. But yeah, absolutely great point, Rosie. We just don't want to be proliferating yet another standard.
Thanks.
Great. Looking at the time, then I think we're sort of 5 minutes over, but I think that's okay. We can manage that. So I think let's move to the breakout rooms. So we're just going to move everyone to breakout rooms now, and again, just get into some good discussion and try to capture as much of your feedback as possible. So I think Michelle, pop us in, and yep. Great. I think we've got everyone back in the main room then. So again, thanks everyone for what I hope were interesting discussions. I'm sure they were interesting for us as the DARE team, and always very insightful and very useful. So we're sort of going to now, each of the facilitators on our side will just sort of talk through, try to capture some of the key ideas and key discussions that we had. And then what we'll do is we'll open up the floor for any final questions, any final discussion points that anyone wants to raise. And I will probably start because I have the mic and try to get through that reasonably quickly. So in our group, we did sort of talk about all the recommendations, but I think there were a couple where we sort of had a bit of a deeper discussion just based on interest and sort of expertise in the room. So on the first recommendation around the data lifecycle, specifically for cross-domain research, there was sort of, I suppose the idea of this third-party linkage service, everyone said was sort of a powerful idea and a powerful concept, and there are things that already somewhat exist in that direction, but it's really quite a big challenge to do that, right? So we sort of acknowledge that it's a huge challenge in terms of if you want to do federation and having sort of a commonality and common understanding in order to then do this cross-domain linkage. So that was one thing that came through quite strongly. I'm just looking here at some of the comments in our Jamboard. There was also the idea of the consolidation and concentration of data using algorithms for picking out key features and trends. So the use of algorithms to do this and to support that. And then I think that was sort of the main idea here. I think there was general support here, but it was sort of an acknowledgement that it's going to be a really big challenge to get common understanding and then buy-in across the board from the different research domains. On the second recommendation, so this is around sort of the new data types, so very much how the nature of data is changing and sort of away from the structured data set model. There was an interesting sort of point about progeny versus quantity of data needs to be carefully considered. So it's not just about the quantity of data in, but also the progeny of that data and how that impacts things further along. Just looking here, quality control was a big topic here as well. How do you sort of manage the quality control within that data, especially if it's real time, and how do you deal with corrections? Just looking, we didn't go too deep into pets, so I'm going to skip that one. There was sort of the UKRI-wide metadata standard and the working group around that sort of, again, very much supported, but it was very clear that it's quite a challenging thing to do. And how do you really, I suppose, balance the depth that you need to go to with this minimal metadata standard, because it's really, it's quite a challenge to find the right sweet spot for that. I think probably those were the main points, and looking at the time, I'm going to hand it over. There were a couple of others, but I think let's pass the ball to, I see Hans-Erik on my screen first. So Hans-Erik.
Not muted. Okay, sure, absolutely. We had a lively discussion. It was terrific. I learned about a whole bunch of new things, which is always true. One thing that came up was that it's important to do horizon scanning and look where, of course, the overall field is going and where it might go in a few years out. Cloud computing, of course, is really big today, and it promises to be even bigger. The challenge was raised in terms of potential vendor lock-in if you do go with the cloud, where each vendor's approach to, say, metadata standards and how you best optimize for their environment may not work so well for a different cloud provider. So if you want to do cross-domain analysis between, say, Google's platform and Amazon's platform, that might be pretty tricky to do well. That's, of course, is also true for, say, academic environments. Just anytime you do cross-domain analysis is tricky, but that is something that we are, as they are looking at, to do federated linkage and analytics. We had a representative from the Health Research Authority who brought up a number of important points on sort of data governance and where that takes us in terms of data access over time, and the need for consent, and the needs to respect existing laws of confidence, GDPR, and that we really should only access the minimum amount of data required to do an experiment, and that is important to be mindful of that over time. Again, when we start working with large data sets. If I look at the panels in the Jamboard, so for the first one, enhance the data lifecycle across domain research. So one thing is to work with approved pipelines where you can be assured that the output is safe, to minimize the amount of output checking, perhaps even not have to do it at all. That's one thing that came up. That we need to look ahead at how theories are developing today, and again, horizon scan is important. That will enhance the usability of data over time. And again, there are lots of legal regimes that we need to be mindful of and to navigate very closely in order for this all to work. We have, in terms of new data types, of course, wearables were something that was mentioned in the Jamboard here. the issues with new data types and near real-time delivery. The complication might be that the data management teams might not have the technical expertise, and there might be lack of defined data collection standards or specifications for these new types of data products that, or data generating mechanisms. So in terms of privacy enhancing technologies, one thing that was mentioned is the use of synthetic data to enhance the privacy and especially the workup of models for research. Sorry, I'm trying to read at the same time here. In terms of establishing a UK-wide metadata standard or working groups for this, just establishing metadata standards, closer was mentioned as one of the initiatives. And it was recommended that we look at that more closely, which is of course germane, and that there are numerous open standards and ontologies. One thing that came up was that ontologies in pharma, maybe in business environments, are often they are paid for products, they're well developed, and they might not always join up so well with academic products, where in academia we may not have access to those software packages, and so we end up with two different work streams that may make it harder to join up data sets. One thing that came up was the challenge of having DOI identifiers, and when you have them, say at the data set level, and you need to roll them up into a research project-wide DOI, there are solutions to that, but it's proven to be a bit challenging. So if you need to, say, publish an article and used 100 different data sets, do you then reference 100 DOI numbers, or is there a way to coalesce them into one research project specific DOI? And I will hand over to, let's see here, Michelle is next, I think, on my screen.
Thanks, Hans-Erik. So we had a great discussion in our room as well. We talked through the recommendations, first of all. So on recommendation 1, we had some discussion around archiving capability, and there were questions about what archiving policies would be supported, and that in order for it to work, we'd need to know what to archive and what not to, and that would depend on the reusability of data. People also raised that the provenance of the data would need to be made clear and available. And with regards to linkage, it was agreed that third-party linkage could be useful, but only if there are clear guidance and standards on the curation of the data. On recommendation 2, again, there was agreement that it would be useful to explore the implications of new data types. Things like streaming of data and near real-time data should be explored, and that actually in other disciplines that is being looked at, so it'd be important to draw on some of the work that has been done on those areas. It was also raised that it'd be useful to think about emerging data requirements and the links to net zero, and thinking about how that could come together. On recommendation 3, someone gave a really useful example of a study that's been done at Leeds University, where a team gave data to people and asked them to have a look and to see whether they would be able to use that data to identify individuals. And then they looked at that and the process that they use, and use that to kind of automate systems to flag up if someone is trying to access or identify data. And then they've kind of aiming to build that into their systems to ensure that if that does happen, it will flag up. So it's an example of a study, it's consumer data research data that has been used to help improve the privacy enhancing technologies. Then on recommendation 4, which is the UKRI-wide metadata standard working group, across the board it was highlighted that in order for that to work, there'd need to be consistency in terms of the language use and the meaning of different terms. So it identified that someone might use a term, for example, federated metadata, and someone else might use just metadata catalog. But actually those two terms might mean the self-same thing, but are being referred to differently. And so there needs to be standardization first on the language use and the meaning attached to it. And also a key point was raised that for this to work, it would have to be that those who work with the data and understand the data most should be the ones who develop and should be funded to develop that understanding, those metadata standards. So using the right people to develop those standards. We didn't really get to touch on metadata, recommendation 5 that much, but we did go on to the questions a bit. And there was a lot of discussion around kind of the way technology is changing the landscape of data discovery, and how kind of gathering metadata in an automated way is a challenge and will continue to be a challenge. And that we need to kind of think about the social challenge actually more than the technical challenge. So the idea of how to acquire the right metadata and what safeguards what safeguards there might be preventing access to some of this data. So for example, smart technology could be useful, but can it be accessed and can it be used? And if so, how and what form? So those are just some of the topics that were raised within our discussions. With regards to, again, the metadata standards, it was raised that that would be quite difficult to mandate and to police. So there'd have to be kind of very clear systems in place to ensure that people are meeting those standards, which could potentially create an extra job. So it's important the right people are deployed to police that without taking away from the time of researchers. I'll stop there and I will hand over to Jerry.
Thank you, Michelle. So given we're short of time, rather than cover areas that were already covered, I'm going to focus in on 2 areas that came up for quite a lot of discussion in our breakout room. One was this question of new and novel data types, particularly IoT data. So certain things were highlighted around this, around quality and reliability of data. It isn't always of the highest quality. Volume of data. We're generating data at a pace that we may not be able to hold. So we need strategies and approaches as we look at data lifecycle that include also the deletion of data and retention of data. So we need strategies for that. And also the risks of IoT type data being delivered in real time raises some interesting questions around how do we ensure that we can do linkage, but also it's suitably de-identified. So we had quite a lot of discussion actually on a couple of different boards around the usage of IoT type data. I think there's a view that it's going to be really important, but it does bring with it some interesting different approaches, and also how we use that alongside maybe more traditional data sets. We did spend actually quite a lot of time discussing metadata at a number of different levels. So both at the technical level of there being sufficient commonality to allow us to be able to do linkage across different domains, but also ensuring that if you do provide metadata, you go to sufficient depth that that's useful from a discovery point of view. It isn't purely at the administrative level, that there is structural metadata down to the level that as a researcher I can understand what the data set really contains, what the variables in the data set are, how they're encoded, what they represent, what their statistical distributions look like. But that then raises the question that I think has already been touched on, which is this isn't trivial. To do this in a consistent way requires time from those who are the data custodians to construct the metadata and to maintain that metadata. So there is approaches to funding that need to be explored here as well. But also there's a narrative, there's a story to be told as well. Perhaps we talk about creating the metadata a lot from the point of view of the benefit externally to the data custodian. And perhaps we've not told the story quite so well that actually there's an internal benefit as well. You're encapsulating the knowledge of that data set, so that if somebody who maybe has been using this data set for the last 10, 15, 20 years moves on, retires, you're capturing their knowledge and their insight into how that data set is really constructed, its warts, its nuances. So we can probably tell the story of why metadata is useful internally and externally, perhaps better than we've done. But the funding one did come through, that if we're to really be able to capture metadata, whatever standards we adopt, whatever tools we adopt, there are people who've got to sit down and do this work. It's a high skilled piece of work. It takes time, and it's not a one-off piece of work. It needs to be maintained. So the funding question came in through quite strongly, and it's something we need to explore. One other we did touch on it briefly. We did touch on pets. It wasn't necessarily an area that people in the room were necessarily strongly experts in, but there was some question around some of these technologies are actually quite complex, and therefore as we look around any work around guidelines and piloting, we need to think through how they're applied, ensure that they don't add additional lag into the data provisioning, access to data, and also that there is guidance that can help those designing studies work out how they work with the various pets. And one topic, and probably it flows through to our next workshop, was there was quite a lot of discussion still around the challenges of access to data. We started off with quite a lot of discussion on just how long it's still taking. And that's an access request, but it is also a data preparation and provisioning question as well. And that there is still very significant lag in getting timely access to data, and that this restricts some of the research questions that are being addressed. So that's a topic we definitely need to go into in more depth when we hold our fifth workshop on access and accreditation in a week and a bit's time. So those are just some additional ones. We covered many of the same topics as well as the other breakout rooms. And with that, I'd like to just pass over to Lizzie.
Hi, yeah, I've got my camera off because my internet's playing up a bit, so apologies if you lose me or I turn into a robot. I'll very quickly try and run through it because we don't have much time left. So I think generally there was a lot of support for the kind of ambitions of some of the recommendations, but also a real acknowledgement of how challenging some of them might be. And a lot of this was based on skill gaps, different legislative frameworks for different types of data, also the how well the legislation and information governance can actually keep up with new technologies as well, and that being a barrier to developing these. In terms of there was also a feeling that some sort of middle management stewardship model would be useful for several of these recommendations. So just looking at the Jamboard now, something that came up in terms of standardization, so especially around recommendation 2 of exploring implications of new data types and models for sharing. There was a feeling that although standardization has benefits in many ways, it can also be a barrier because different types of data require different frameworks and different technology. So there needs to be a balance between standardization and also information governance, but also flexibility to allow different types of data to have the framework around them that supports their use. There was also a feeling that any innovation needs to be research driven rather than innovation for the sake of innovation. We need to work out what research we want to do, what questions there are before developing some of the technology. Had quite a few examples when talking about privacy enhancing technology of existing work going on in the space that we should loop in with, which was helpful. From a public perspective, there's also a feeling that both standardization and privacy enhancing technologies are reassuring for the public, particularly standardization kind of offers a gold standard for how data is kept secure. In terms of UKRI-wide metadata, this has been touched on already a bit, but there's a feeling that it's very difficult to find people with the sufficient knowledge across all sectors to be able to set such a standard that works for all different types of data and sectors. So there was also suggestion of ISO certification to support metadata standards. And yeah, again, especially around DOIs, there was a feeling that there's a real skills gap there as well. I'll stop there because we've only got a minute left.
Great, thanks. Thanks all. So I know we've only got a minute left, and we're all as a team happy to stay on for 5 minutes. You know, for those who want to stay on and have a bit more of a discussion, of course, please feel free to also drop off. And I just want to say, sort of, we can still have discussion after this, but for those who are dropping off, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for your time this morning. We really do appreciate it. We really do appreciate that taking 2 hours out of your morning is a big commitment. And just again, from our side, thank you very much for being part of the discussion. We have 2 more workshops still towards the end of March, which are going to be very interesting as well. And I'm looking forward to those. So it would be great to have you there as well if you can join. But for those dropping out, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, if you want to continue for another 5 minutes, please feel free to pop in. Just put your hand up, pop it in the chat as you like.